Okay. Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics. As I was just talking about here, somebody's like, first we had a question like, how do you pronounce that word? You pronounce it Nicomachean. This treatise is named after Aristotle's son, Nicomachus. And like all of the Aristotelian esoteric works, they are probably lecture notes, either Aristotle's own lecture notes or the notes of Aristotle's students, in this case perhaps the notes of his son Nicomachus, and that have been kind of compiled and put together and organized by other people. So this is why the Nicomachean ethics are called the Nicomachean ethics. It's Aristotle's son Nicomachus' version of Aristotle's ethics. And it's kind of almost a like spookily appropriate title too, because there's a really strong parental vibe throughout this entire treatise. This is an account of what it means. We read in On the Soul what it means to have a soul. Now we're going to be talking about what it means to have a good soul, have a good human soul, right? What's the difference between better and worse human souls, and how do you get there? It's, as Aristotle points out, a political project. Primarily. That's kind of concerned with this question of like, how do we make good people? And where is it that like most of the labor into making good people comes from? Yeah, I suppose, yeah. How do people become virtuous? Is virtue teachable? Tell me. Is virtue teachable? Or is it acquired through a gift from the gods? Or what's going on there? Is virtue teachable? Who teaches us virtue? Who makes us into the people that we are? Could be parents, right? Yeah, that's a really good candidate, is parents do it, right? It's about raising people, right? This question of a political project that's aimed towards making people into good people, it's not hard to read this as a parenting manual. Of course, then again, you can read it as like a manual for somebody who doesn't really, maybe is kind of, I don't know, at the point of starting to take over your own life, right? And you're not being raised by somebody else, so now you're starting to raise yourself. In which case, it works equally well as a manual. It's all this question about like, how do you get from A to, if you're like, here I am, and here's where I'd like to be. I'm okay, but perhaps I could be better. How do I get from A to B? This is what the Nicomachean ethics is all about. Before we start getting into that, let's do a little bit of recap of what we've been talking about thus far. So we've got this question of the soul that we had been looking at our last meeting. And we looked at 4 different ways of talking about like how we could understand the soul. Help me out here. What are these, like what is the Aristotelian soul? Keeping in mind, we're going to try to get 4 answers here. Give me one. I know it was like 2 days ago.
Isn't there something about like achieving the happiness first?
Yeah, there's something about, there's Eudaimonia? Yeah, we're going to get to that in just a second. That's one of, it's close to one of the things. But back it all the way up to like book 2 of On the Soul, yeah.
Is it like the plant soul, the animal soul?
Well, that's another thing too, so let's keep these things in mind. We're going to talk about Eudaimonia in a second, but we're not there yet. We also have this question of like plant souls, animal souls, and human souls. Oh, that's terrible handwriting. But what is a soul in general? Yes?
It's the form of the living body.
All right, form of the living body. What else is the soul? Yes? It's an organizing principle. I'm going to skip down just a second. It's the organizing principle of the living body. what we'll call the archekineton. Not just us, Aristotle calls it the archekineton. The source of motion, or the organizing principle of motion or change. Yes? The actuality or the activity, right? Of the soul. This is the energeia, as opposed to the dunamis, as opposed to the potential of the living organism. Sorry, not of the soul. The soul isn't the actuality of the soul. It's the actuality, the activity of the organism. The energeia. The at-workness, and the being at work of the living organism. There's one more dash up there. The essence, yeah. And again, we want to be careful here that we don't confuse essence with ousia, because it's not the whole thing. The soul isn't the whole organism. We talked about this, that the soul itself is not an independently existing thing. The soul is the form, whereas the body is matter, right? But back in metaphysics? Yeah, back in metaphysics when we were reading about this and about like form and matter. In fact, back in physics as well. In fact, now that I'm thinking about it, yeah, it's way louder in physics too. We get this account of, hylomorphic unity, they're both needed, they never come apart except in thought. But when it comes to the question of like trying to understand something, this is the register of thought. So perhaps separating matter and form is useful. And form is a way of accessing the essence. So it's the essence of a living organism. And we talked about all different ways of talking about this, the what it is to be of the living organism, the being of the living organism. We might be tempted to say the substance, but that's a step too far, right? Because substance is independently existing. It's not quite ousia. It's the way that we understand ousia in thought, which is to think about the essence, to think about the form, to think about the activity or the organizing principle. We'll notice that he's kind of like he's dancing all around a couple of the four causes here. Dancing all around this question of, all right, so when I see a living organism, I'm like, why? One of those answers is matter, right? A material cause. And that's the body. And then we have these other three causes that we're like, yeah, so what's going on there? What's the efficient cause when I see a living thing? It's the activity, the actuality, the at work of the living body. That's the efficient cause of whatever it is that a living thing does. What about the formal cause? Oh, we got that, right? The form, and we've got the essence. We also have this organizing principle thing, so we have a couple of different approaches to morphe, right, to that formal cause. We also have a final cause, the for the sake of which, or the good of something, right? This is this last way of understanding a why question. So when I see a living thing, and I'm thinking to myself, like, why? Why is it doing that thing? What's its goal? That's what starts to bring us into this question of eudaimonia. It's that last final cause that springboards a conversation about souls in general into a conversation about what's a good soul, or what are all souls aiming at, right? For human souls, we're aiming at eudaimonia. Human souls are aiming at eudaimonia, but eudaimonia, properly speaking, doesn't really belong to anything else but a human. We do have plant souls, animal souls, and human souls, and they can all flourish in their respective ways. But the way that a human soul flourishes is particular to the human organism, to the human way of life, or the human form of life, right? Plant souls, we talked about, well, what are they like? First of all, plants have souls, which is maybe news to some folks. Does it make sense why Aristotle would say that, given what he says that a soul is? Do plants move and change? Are plants alive? All right, well, they got bodies. What's the other part? The other part is going to be the plant soul. And what's the plant soul like? It's got a nutritive soul. Sometimes this is talked about as a vegetative soul. Some other interesting things about plant souls. They're divisible. That's crazy. You can take a plant and cut a piece of it off, and both parts are still alive. You can get them both going. And you're like, oh, what just happened? And now I've got 2 plants. I used to have just one. Yeah, that's because the plant soul is divisible. Whoa, crazy. Some animal souls are divisible too, right? Earthworms, planarians. You just cut that thing right in half and it still stays alive. Both sides stay alive.
So does that mean they can be consumed as well? Like the souls? If you eat vegetables, does that mean that you're literally
Am I
eating plant
eating
souls?
the plant soul?
Yeah.
Is the plant alive when I eat it?
Technically. What about cows? Like, what if they
And
eat
the question,
grass?
maybe the question is, like, if you say when you eat the soul, like, does it still stay with it? Like, I eat the form, the activity, the organizing principle of a plant. I destroy it
It
when
sounds-
I chew it up in my teeth, right?
Yeah.
There is no soul by the time I swallow it.
Oh.
That organizing principle is like completely obliterated. I've disorganized it as much as I possibly can, 36 times before every swallow. So yeah, I would say, I don't know, maybe the plant soul is present when it goes in my mouth, but by the time I swallow it, no more plant soul, it's gone.
It sounds weird, but I mean.
It is,
by
yeah, it does sound
this,
weird.
yeah.
Well, to be fair, it was a bit of a peculiar question, but yeah, you don't necessarily, I mean, in one sense, perhaps, you gain the vital force of a plant when you eat it. That's why you eat things, right? To get energy. It's not like a mysterious spiritual thing, necessarily.
I wonder what a soul tastes like.
I don't know if it really tastes like any. I don't even know if tastes like is the right question for a soul, right? Just like looks like maybe isn't the right question for a soul. It's an abstract thing. All right, animal souls. How are they different than plant souls? They've got the nutritive part. What else do they have? Yeah, they have desire and fear, which are both kind of modes of perception, or evaluative perception. So they have a perceiving soul, or a desiring soul, or a fearing soul. Animals got that as well as the nutritive soul. And this is what allows them to move around, to have local motion, to go from place to place on the surface of the earth. And not just do it willy-nilly, but to like do it purposively, towards the things that it wants, away from the things that it fears. Human soul, what do we got? Reason, there we go. Every philosopher is always waiting to like spring that one on us. Or the thinking soul. And humans have that along with all the other things too. Okay. So, when we start asking this question about like, all right, so what is a human soul that is functioning well like? What's the difference between one that's functioning well and one that's functioning poorly? We start thinking, we start asking these questions about like, well, what is the goal? What is the telos? What is the final cause for every soul? And Aristotle kind of offers up a variety of possibilities. First, he identifies that eudaimonia is like clearly the answer to this question, that it's all about being happy. And at our last meeting, I kind of challenged this as a good translation for eudaimonia. Does anybody remember why? It was right towards the end and people were starting to pack up. Flourishing might be a better one. What's the difference between flourishing and happiness as translation for eudaimonia? Carrie. Yeah, happiness is kind of, sometimes we think of it as a feeling, and eudaimonia is most definitely not a feeling. It's, what would we say instead? Yeah, it's an activity. So this we might think of like it's the doing, right? We're kind of back to this question of the actuality or the activity of the organism. That's the soul. And when it's acting well, right? When a soul is acting well, when it's doing all the things that organism needs to do in order to flourish, it's enacting eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is an activity. We're going to get another term here today that we've seen before. Arete. Oftentimes translated as virtue. We saw it in Meno when it was this question of what is virtue and what is it teachable. It was the same term that was going on here. This is going to be a different sort of thing. It's we're going to talk about like how exactly it's related to the activity of eudaimonia. And it's a little bit of a puzzle. Let me knock out one more thing, and then we'll get to this question of what exactly is the relationship between eudaimonia and arete. First, once we've identified that happiness or flourishing is the goal for all human activity. And do we buy this, by the way? It's the first thing Aristotle does. It's like right out of the gate in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1. He says, that's the goal of all human activity. Really? Yeah.
I mean, does he mean being happy at all moments, all the time, or sort of an overall happiness? Like,
He tackles this later on in Book 1. I'm not sure if Baird keeps this in the book, but there's this question of like, do you have to be happy every single moment of your life in order to say that you've led a happy life or a flourishing
do you
life?
think
Yeah.
it's beneficial for a human to feel like melancholy at times, or to be reflective, or
Well, we would kind of like shed some light on it here where we'd say like, keep in mind it's not a feeling, right?
well, I guess to act then.
Yeah, to act, well, but it's not even acting as if you had the feeling. Being melancholy might be an appropriate sort of flourishing. Depends on what the times and circumstances call for. And this is the sort of thing that Mina would say, right? Different virtue for every season and every different type of person. Perhaps the flourishing activity, perhaps the activity of like a fully functioning, well-functioning human being in certain circumstances is to be melancholy. I don't know. When your city gets raided and completely like destroyed by the Spartans, that's a good time to be bummed out. A happy person does that. We'll get to this. Oh, well, no, sure. Why not? As good a time as any to talk about this too. What's the role of luck in all this? Because Aristotle notes that like sometimes the universe just takes a big giant crap on you. And there's really not much that you can do about this. Whether or not your eudaimon is a little bit in your own control, but some of it is completely beyond your control. And this, again, has to do with this question of virtue and how it relates. We'll fill in the gaps of this puzzle in just a moment. Let's keep it going on this question of, like, is this plausible? And we say, this is the goal of all human activity. And the way that I played this at the end of our last meeting was I said, like, pick any human activity and just ask why. Why did that happen? And you'll get an answer. And if you why that answer, you'll get another answer. And if you why that answer, you'll get another answer. And eventually, Aristotle seems to think that eventually it's always going to get back to so that I can be happy. Is that believable? Are you buying that? Why'd you come to class? So that I can get a good grade. Why do you want a good grade? So that I can graduate. Why do you want to graduate? So that I can get a good job. Why do you want to get a good job? For money. Why do you want money? So you can buy stuff. Why do you want to buy this stuff? To be comfortable. Why do you want to be comfortable? To be happy. Why do you want to be happy? Well, that's a stupid question. Everybody wants to be happy. Maybe, like, is that a stupid question when I say, like, why do you want to be happy? And we're just like, happy is what you want to be. That's a, like, I don't, there are no more whys after to be happy. That's the last why. It's the final cause of human activity. Yes, Rachel.
What about, like, so whenever the final cause is not necessarily your happiness, but happiness for someone else?
Ah, well, are you talking about happiness as a feeling or happiness as an activity?
I don't know, so, like, what I was, like, running through in my head is, like, a birthday present. So, like, you go out and you buy a birthday present. Why do you do that?
Because you want somebody else to be happy. Some cynical folks amongst here will say, like, because you want yourself to feel happy when you see them open it. And they're like, oh, it's what I always wanted. But, like, maybe you actually genuinely want this other person to be happy. Is that where it ends? Why do you want other people to be happy?
Because I like them and I want them to be happy.
Why do you want the people that you like to be happy? Don't you want the people that you don't like to be happy too?
I mean, yeah, but like...
Benefits to our friends, harm to our enemies? Is that what's going on here?
Yeah, like, if they're happy, that's cool, whatever, but, like, I'm not going to actively pursue their happiness.
Yeah, you'll measure how much effort you're going to put into it. But you put a lot of effort into the happiness of your friends, right? Why? Is it because that's what good friends do? Because I want to be a good friend. I want to be good at doing this human thing. And part of being good at doing the human thing, if we're talking about happiness as flourishing, or eudaimonia as flourishing, and as an activity, we might kind of come back to this question. And this is the subtle shift. When you sell happiness as a feeling, you're like, this is why everybody does anything, is ultimately because of happiness. And it's really believable when you say it as a feeling. Oh yeah, everybody wants to feel happy. But then Aristotle he's making this subtle shift here. We can tell it in the way that he uses the term, especially when we start seeing the relationship to arete, to virtue, that he doesn't mean it as a feeling, he means it as an activity. And maybe this is a little bit of a tougher sell. The idea here being that everybody wants to flourish. Everybody wants to be living a good life. Is that true of everybody's actions? That when you Y-chain them, it'll all come back to this question of, because I want to live well. Maybe that's less obvious. Is it equally true on reflection? We all have this idea of like what a good life would be like. If all you want to do is to feel happy, you just find a way to like be a sustainable heroin junkie or something like that. Make enough money that you can like buy enough junk for the rest of your life and just sit there and be like just whacked out. Feeling great all the time. Is that a good life? Is that a life that you want for yourself? It's interesting. So that's maybe a possible real option. We have kind of like science fiction-y thought experiment options as well. We could say like, we'll put you in the Matrix, right? We'll put you in an experience machine and you will feel nothing but bliss until you die. Do you want that option? Yeah? Nothing but bliss until you die. Is there anybody who's kind of thinking to yourself like, I see the appeal, but no, that would not be a good life. That would not be a good human life. Because it wouldn't be real, right? This is Cypher's decision in The Matrix. You guys familiar with this movie, The Matrix?
Yeah.
There was one of them and no more. There were no other movies after The Matrix. And Cypher has this question. He's like, yeah, do I have this ignorance is bliss sort of thing? And notice he wants to remember nothing. He doesn't want to like be put back into the Matrix remembering like what he's done to be put there, or to think that it's not real, which is maybe a condition that we could have. But when I ask you, would you like to be in a simulation, have a simulation of a life that is nothing but pleasant feelings? Some of us might say like, yeah, that actually sounds pretty good. Some of us might be like, that's not doing it the right way. I would maybe like to feel good all the time, but I want it to be real. I want it to be like done the right way. I want it to be done through like a flourishing human life, not as some experience bag that just like feels good all the time.
But if you don't know that it's not real, is it real to the individual?
Yeah, but we're asking you right now to make the decision. Like, would you prefer to not know that it was real?
Yeah.
Or to like live a real life, right? Whatever. Yeah, we do have questions about like, well, what, it would still be real though, right? Where do we get off saying that the simulated experience isn't real? It's still a real experience. It's just maybe not an experience of the things that we think that it is. Yeah, these are all interesting questions that I'm not going to try to answer right now. We're veering off track. Yes, Andrew.
Perhaps we could consider that to be like a cheaper form of eudaimonia, like just giving it to you all the time, like I struggled to get here.
Yeah, that something like that's doing it the right way.
Yeah, but like the struggle, it's kind of like if you're out, I feel like when you're out in the cold, it feels awful. When you come in the heat, it feels amazing. Sort of like that kind of achievement instead of just like sitting in a lounge the whole time.
Wouldn't it be nice to just, I'm kind of channeling what maybe Gretchen would say, wouldn't it be nice to just skip to the amazing feeling and forget the cold part?
I don't know, but when I can look back and compare to how I felt before, it's like, wow.
Yeah. Maybe. We might ask the same thing about money. Like, would you rather have money just given to you, or would you rather earn it? And that's, yeah, a lot of people are like, I don't know. Like, I'd like to, I suppose, like, because everybody's watching, maybe I'll say that, like, oh, I'd like to get it the right way. But if given the option to just steal it, like, if you're like, why are you in class? Just so I can get a good grade. Why are you getting a good grade? So I can get a degree. Blah, 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 blah. Eventually that went to money, and then money went to stuff, and then stuff went to happiness. Skip the whole school thing. Just start learning how to be a really good bank robber or drug dealer. or any of the other possible ways that you can make money that I'm pretty sure are quicker and easier and probably more lucrative than what not all of you, most of you, especially the humanity majors, you're not going to make as much money as you would if you turned to crime and got good at it. Why not do it that way?
You could do both.
Could do both.
Humanities during the day and crime during the night.
I would watch that TV show. Is it because it's not doing it the right way? This is the reason why those of us who, when faced with the ring of Gyges thought experiment, those of us who are like, I don't think I would like to be Gyges, so this was the thought, because like, that's not doing it the right way. But it's worth pointing out that not everybody said that, right? Some people are like, are you kidding me? Of course I'd like to be Gyges. If the other option is the just sucker, yeah, I want to be Gyges. And I'm kind of surprised at everybody else who like doesn't want to be Gyges. I'm glad that they're in my community because I can exploit them. They're just suckers. I'm not sure if happiness as flourishing is actually everybody's motivating factor. It's a good idea. It sounds noble. I think it's an interesting starting point for Aristotle to say, like, this is what all human activity is aimed at. I don't know if it's true in fact. I think it might be if we kind of skip to, like, shift over just a little bit from, like, what are the reasons that people do act to what are the reasons that people ought to act. Maybe he's right there. That this is a better target than just feeling happy. Aristotle opens this up into like this question of like, we can say that happiness or flourishing is the good life. We can maybe even set it as a stipulative definition. But there's still quite a bit of debate as to what the good life is. What sort of life is a good life? And one of the options that he floats here is we could have a pleasure-seeking life. A life devoted to nothing but seeking pleasure. Would this be a good and flourishing life? And he seems skeptical of this, but he's open to the possibilities. Like, people say this. People do say that the pleasure-seeking life is the good life. He also floats another possibility, that there's an honor-seeking life. Which is not so much about pleasure, it's about, like, I don't know, being well-regarded in the eyes of others. Aristotle's skeptical of this one as well. In part because this means that, like, your reason, your final cause is now outside of yourself, which is peculiar for a living thing, right? All of your causes are supposed to be within yourself when you're a living thing. And an honor-seeking life depends on what other people think of you, so it kind of puts part of your soul outside of you. Anybody want to guess what the third option is? There are only going to be three. Pleasure-seeking life, an honor-seeking life, and any philosopher's got to include this sort of life. Yeah, or a life of contemplation, yeah? A thinking life. And interestingly, he never really settles this issue. He never says, like, this is the right, well, certainly not in book 1. He'll come back around to it in book 6, I think. And perhaps unsurprisingly for a philosopher, he's going to say, like, ooh, I don't know, that one seems like the best candidate. But it is a little bit up in the air. Eudaimonia is said in many ways. Sometimes people talk about it as the pleasure-seeking life. Sometimes people talk about it as the honor-seeking life. Sometimes people talk about it as the life of contemplation. And let's be honest, a life that doesn't involve any pleasure at all, it's going to be tough to call it happy. In any sense, right? If you're miserable for your entire life, I don't know if we can say that you are flourishing. If you have no sense of honor, you're not respected by like the people in your community or your peers. I don't know if we could call that a happy life in the sense of either a feeling or the activity of flourishing. So maybe these things are totally important, but maybe they're not sufficient conditions for leading a happy and flourishing life. Perhaps they're necessary conditions. And we'll get a little bit of a clue into this by kind of reading back into all the different parts of the soul. The human soul has a thinking component, nous. That's the thinking part of the human soul, the rational part of the human soul. But it's got two other parts too. It's got a vegetative soul and it's got a desiring and perceiving soul. If the human being is going to flourish, all three parts need to be rocking. They need to be working at full capacity. To have the thinking part of the soul working well, while the perceiving and desiring part doesn't work well, or while the nutritive part isn't working well, that's not a flourishing human being. This is an interesting sort of thing that Aristotle's doing that is maybe the same sort of thing that Plato was doing, only maybe he's kind of nudging it back in a slightly different direction. He's kind of identifying this interesting and very Greek, by the way, sort of tightrope that's being walked. The previous to folks like Plato and Aristotle, the idea of virtue, or the idea of flourishing, eudaimonia, or as flourishing perhaps, or talking about like a happy life, or talking about virtue in the sense of excellence. The Greek sense of this was focused perhaps more on some of these the things that are maybe a little further away from thinking, maybe things that are a little further away from moral virtue as well. It was just flat out excellence. So bodily health, for example, this was like totally on the map for Greeks when they were thinking of like, what's an excellent person? They're like a strong person, a healthy person. The same way that we would say of any animal, right? What's a flourishing animal look like? It's strong, it's healthy, it's got bodily health. And this is certainly part of it for Aristotle. And Socrates and Plato acknowledge this too. Socrates and Plato nudge this into the direction of moral virtue, and Aristotle wants to acknowledge this as well. But it's important to keep in mind that he's talking about like maintaining all of these at the same time. All three parts of the soul, all these three parts of the soul, which are slightly different, but we might recognize them. Anybody do recognize them? Pleasure-seeking, honor-seeking, and contemplation? Yeah, these are the three parts of the soul that Plato identified. We didn't read it, but I talked about it a little bit. It's in the early books of Republic, between book 2 and, book 6 and 7, which is where we rejoined things. But yeah, Plato said, yeah, 3 different types of people in the city, 3 different parts of the soul. He makes the city-soul analogy. And it follows this: pleasure-seeking, honor-seeking, and reason. Virtue. What is that? And what's its relationship to eudaimonia, happiness or flourishing? Is it the same thing? What's the excellence of a human? It's a human living excellently. Why duplicate terms here? Moderation's definitely going to be a big part of it, yeah? We'll get into that. You can seek, can you seek too much pleasure? You can seek pleasure too much. Can you have too much pleasure? You need moderate pleasure? Wouldn't more be better? Moderation's going to be a big part of it. We'll get to that in just a second. If eudaimonia is the activity of a flourishing human, what's the virtue of a human? Yes.
Well, aren't both regarded as good? To be a virtuous person is it's a good thing.
Something that's considered to be good, and so is happiness. They're both good, right?
So
they have that in common.
Maybe a virtuous person, maybe a happiness is just a part of it, or maybe vice versa. Maybe virtue is a part of happiness.
Maybe virtue is a part of happiness? Which part? These seem like they might be 3 parts of happiness. Is it one of those 3?
It's really hard to
It is.
point out.
That's why I asked the question. Andrew? Oh, no. Nobody wants to tackle this? No, geez, no. Let me see if I can clear this up just a little bit. Maybe that was too bold of a fishing expedition there for me. Before we talk about arete or virtue, maybe we want to talk about, like, what's the opposite of virtue?
Anti-virtue.
Anti-virtue. Vice. There we go. Vice is the other thing. It's like whatever virtue is, vice is the opposite. And both virtues and vices, they're both, let's make it plural. They're both hexes. The singular is hexis. Hexis is a funny little word that Aristotle coins. A hexis, it comes from the Greek word ekein, which means to like hold on to or to have something. Think like the Spanish tener. Like that's hexis. And it's like a holding on to something. Both virtue and vice are hexes. They're a little bit of a withholding, but it's not just a like holding back. It's like holding in order to do something. This is maybe like a familiar concept already. I think we've addressed something like this before. But one way of understanding all hexes, including virtues and vices, well, let's focus specifically on virtues. These are the characteristics, or maybe the character traits. Sometimes folks like Joe Sachs will call these active conditions. Propensity for action is kind of a nice way to look at it. In accordance with flourishing, with human flourishing. What are virtues? Virtues are all those character traits that you have. It's like, what is the state that your soul needs to be in? How does your soul need to be organized in order for you to act in a flourishing way? In order for you to enact human happiness? Eudaimonia. And what is eudaimonia? Well, Aristotle goes on to define it as, it's the activity of the human soul in accordance with virtue. Nice little circular pair of definitions there. Happiness is the activity of the human soul in accordance with virtue. What is virtue? Virtue are all those, it's the active condition for like the human soul in accordance with flourishing. Ugh, not a whole lot of help there. But we do get this sense of like what the relationship between the two of them is. This is like, what does it have to be like? What does the soul have to be like in order to act this way? And eudaimonia is the acting this way. Where have we seen this sort of relationship, or this kind of like, one is like a holding on and the other one is like the springing into action? What's that? Body and soul? We saw it in body and soul? Yeah, we also saw it in, I think this was in our last meeting. We can think of eudaimonia as, this is the first energeia. Sorry, not the first. It's the second. The secondest. Second energeia of the human soul, whereas the arete is the first energeia. I am literally speaking Greek right now. Do you guys understand like what I say when I say arete is first energeia and eudaimonia is second energeia? All right. And maybe go back to your notes. Remember we said when we were talking about the difference between potentiality and actuality, when we noticed that the soul is the actuality or the activity of an organism, that it's the energeia, we said the body is the potential, it's the dunamis, the potentiality of a living organism. The soul is the activity of the living organism. And we encountered this little puzzle, which was that the living body isn't constantly active all the time. It has to rest. And we talked about how there's like a raw potentiality. Remember we talked about it in terms of playing the violin? That like if you've never learned how to play the violin before, you are merely a potential violin player. Like completely in the realm of potentiality. If you've learned how to play the violin but you're not currently playing, you are not fully in the activity, in the ergon of violin playing, but you're more of an actuality than the other person, right? You're not mere potential violin player. You're perhaps plausibly a violin player who's just not playing right now. Your soul has been organized through education and practice to play the violin, and when it comes time to play, you're ready to spring into action. That is first energeia, and that's arete, that's virtue. Virtue is the state of the soul. It's the way that the soul is organized. Perhaps it's this organizing principle. It gets at like two sides of what it is that the soul's activity is all about. There's an activity that's actually acting, And then there's an activity that's ready for action. That's a propensity for action in accordance with the right sort of action, in accordance with flourishing. So there's a little bit of circularity here in the way that he's defining arete and eudaimonia in terms of one another. But it's not necessarily a vicious sort of circularity. He's maybe just kind of like fleshing out the terms a little bit, articulating the relationship between these two things. And perhaps we'll get a better sense of what's going on here when we recognize that whatever this is, whatever virtue is, whatever happiness is, it needs to be the full functioning of all of the parts of the human soul, including reason. So we'll get yet another definition of what eudaimonia or even virtue are. That happiness or eudaimonia, this is the activity of the human soul in accordance with virtue, and that means in accordance with reason. Not solely given over to reason, but in accordance with reason. There are lots of... How far? Maybe here's the question. How far does reason go in your activity? Think about all the activities of your body. Are they all reasonable?
Yes.
What do you mean by like activities in our body?
Everything that your body does, everything that's part of like the movement and change that you engage in such that you are a living thing.
They're much more intuition than they are like reason.
Yeah, well, could they be reasoned? And really everything? Think about all the things that you're doing right now. You seem relatively still, like you're not doing much. You're doing so much right now. You're metabolizing food. You are moving things through your intestines. You're pumping blood all through your body. You're breathing. You're blinking. You're regulating your hormones. Like all of your hair is growing right now. So much of what your body is doing right now, so much of what your soul is doing right now has nothing to do with reason. This is an important aspect of like the human soul. We mentioned this when we were talking about like you desire something, but you realize that that's a desire that's not going to lead you to some other greater desire. So you decide, you make a choice. You think through the issue and you say like, I desire it, but I'm not going to go for it. I'm going to go for this other thing instead. I'm going to eat healthy food rather than delicious food because I desire bodily health. Even though I also desire healthy food. I have to like sit there and weigh and think through this. This is the triumph of the rational soul over the irrational soul, which suggests that the two are not always in line with one another, right? Sometimes your irrational soul wants one thing, your rational soul wants something else. Aristotle reprises an idea that Plato was playing around with too, this idea that the rational soul needs to be in charge. The rational soul needs to kind of like get everybody else in line. So we have reason, where we have the rational soul. In fact, let's put it over here. We have the rational soul. And then we have the like vegetative and the animal soul, which they're irrational just by definition, right? They're not part of the rational soul. They are irrational. I don't think when I do them, or when these parts of my soul are at work. And the idea here is that the rational soul is supposed to be in charge of, or kind of order, or govern the irrational soul. But it's worth pointing out that it can't do this for everything. There are some parts of the irrational soul that are just intransigent. Try as you might, you can't reason your metabolism into like being faster. Does that make sense? You can't like think your hair growing faster and do that. There are so many things that your body is doing, particularly things that are associated with the nutritive or vegetative soul that like just have nothing at all to do with reason. We have an irrational soul that is completely independent. Of reason. And then Aristotle notes that but we do have another part of the irrational soul that the way that he says it is it speaks the same language as reason. It talks to reason, or reason can talk to it. What is that like? These irrational aspects of my soul that talk to reason? I don't know. Let's say, Let's say you're scared of something, but you know that it's not really something that is all that dangerous. Can you talk yourself down? Can you see something like, oh my God, that's scary, and then you feel scared? Can you make yourself not feel scared just by thinking through it? Can you do this with anger? Can you do this with any emotion? That it kind of comes on irrationally, but it does speak the same language as reason as well, right? You can kind of be like, all right, settle down. A lot of people are saying yes. Is there anybody who is skeptical? There's kind of like, not me. Sometimes I'll go ahead and say it. Sometimes I'm angry and I'm like, this is completely unreasonable. And like, I'm still sitting there just like, ugh.
So usually, like, you've made that decision, so, like, you know, like, this is unreasonable, but I'm going to be unreasonable anyway. You know what I mean?
Oh, I hardly ever say I'm going to be unreasonable anyway, but maybe that's just me. Sometimes I do try to be aware of it for the sake of other people. I say, like, I'm angry right now and it's completely unreasonable. I prefer not to be angry because it's completely unreasonable, but everybody know that, like, I don't have full control over it.
Oh, okay.
It seems, it's slippery, right? Like, you can kind of talk yourself down, but other times it seems like the emotion is just like, it's just got a mind of its own. It's not really a mind at all. It's irrational, right? You're just going to be irrationally angry. You're going to be irrationally happy, right? You might desire something irrationally. You're like, I know that is like a terrible thing to like. Can you talk yourself out of desiring things that you know are harmful to you? Sometimes, a little bit. Sometimes it's just like heart wants what the heart wants. All I can do is be aware of this desire and try to stop myself from it. Gretchen, yeah.
So it's like the basis for cognitive behavioral therapy, where they like go
It is.
through like you have this thought, but it's irrational. Why is it? And you go through like this is why. It's like the basis for whole therapy.
If you like cognitive behavioral therapy, you are going to love Aristotle's virtue ethics. This is like what it's all about. He recognizes that, look, there's this part of the soul that just doesn't speak reason at all. It's going to be the way that it's going to be. Your metabolism is just how it is. You need to sleep a certain number of hours every night. Try as you may to like reason your way out of this. You can like reason your way to like stay awake for a little while. Eventually, your body's just going to be like, you know what? I'm going to take it from here. We're going to sleep right now. And you fall down. You do the same thing with like breathing, right? You can be like, I'm not going to breathe. You can do that for a little while before your body's like, all right, I'm taking it from here. You can do it with blinking as well. Like, I'm not going to blink. But like only for so long before your body goes like, enough of that, idiot. There are these completely independent, there are these irrational parts of your soul that are completely independent of reason, and they can't be otherwise. Aristotle says, these are our soul, this is what we are like by nature. There's that word nature again. We're getting a third sense of by nature. In this case, he means that which can't be otherwise. But the rational soul can be otherwise. It involves things like decisions and choices. We'll see in Book 3 that these end up being kind of important components of this virtue theory. But yeah, there are like things about the rational soul that can be otherwise. You can come to one conclusion or come to another conclusion through the application of reason. Oh, and also this part of the irrational soul that speaks the same language as reason, that reason talks to. These are things that can be otherwise. You have a little bit of control over them. And so this is like where virtue and vice are living. This, which can't be otherwise, there's no point in talking about better and worse ways of like your soul that can't be other than the way that they are, right? There's no like how it should be or how it shouldn't be. There's no better or worse. There's just the way that it is. But of all the things that can be otherwise, like this part of the irrational soul that speaks the same language as reason, and the rational soul, for all of those things that can be otherwise, there is a better and worse. And it's worth talking about what that better and worse is like. It's worth talking about which sorts of things are virtuous and which sorts of things are vicious. Now, when it comes to the activity of the rational soul all by itself, we have one set of virtues that's associated with this. These are what are known as intellectual virtues. That's the rational soul all by itself. This pops up in book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics. We're gonna not read it for this class, but it's worth checking out. There are 5 intellectual virtues. What makes those interesting, I suppose, or different than the other sorts of virtues, we'll see in just a second. The other sorts of virtues that we're concerned with are about this part of the irrational soul that can be otherwise, that does speak the same language as reason. And these have to do with moral virtues. Moral virtue is the proper functioning of this part of the irrational soul that speaks the same language as reason. The rational soul, its proper functioning, at least all by itself, concerns intellectual virtues. Intellectual virtues are acquired through education, Aristotle says, through learning, through contemplation. You can sit around and talk and acquire intellectual virtues. Moral virtues are acquired in a slightly different way. How are moral virtues acquired? How do you get the irrational soul to be on board with what the rational soul wants it to be? And this is the trick that's going on here. There's this part of your soul that can't be otherwise. It's just going to be how it is. You just need to accept that that's the form of life that you have. I prefer to not have to sleep so much, but I'm a sleeping being. That's what I am. This part can be better and worse. I can kind of tune it a little bit. And I want to tune it to be on the same page as reason, because when these two parts of my soul are in conflict with one another, I am not doing well. When I desire the thing that's harmful for me, and I'm like, oh, but I don't want to, that's not pleasant. That's not a human living the way that a human should. A human should be able to say, that's not healthy for me, I don't desire it. And just walk calmly. Wouldn't that be nice if you didn't have to struggle to do the right thing? If you just kind of looked at it and been oh yeah, that's the right thing to do. This is what we're after here, to get moral virtue on the same page as reason, so that there is no conflict, no tension between the two. Yeah, Francesca.
Wouldn't this be child molesters, murderers who say they desire it, they can't help it, it's who they are, but they know it's bad, so they can't not do it. But when they do it, wouldn't that mean they're punishment in a way? I mean, even though we know it's bad, to them
It would be pleasant. This is why the pleasure-seeking life all by itself is not a good life, right? Not a good flourishing life. So there maybe are, and my sense is that, plenty of those folks know that what they're doing is not okay and that it hurts other people, but they can't stop themselves from desiring it. Well, I was going to save this for later, but maybe this is a good time to do this. Be 3 components to any action. There's the desire that's motivating the action. There's the reason that's kind of behind the action. And then there's what actually gets done, right? So we'll know that sometimes these 3 things are not all on board with. They're not all saying exactly the same thing. When somebody is virtuous, they desire what's right. They have reasoned out in their mind. They understand that it's right. And they do what's right. You get all 3 of them. That's a virtuous person. A vicious person, that's somebody who desires the wrong thing. They see things that are harmful to themselves and others, and they're that's what I want. And when they think about it, when they say what in life is best, they say all the most terrible things. They're completely backwards. They think that harmful things are beneficial and beneficial things are harmful, like Thrasymachus maybe. They desire what's wrong, they think that what's wrong is right, and when it comes time for action, they do the wrong thing. That's a vicious person. It's really hard to find vicious people. You got to be really messed up to be vicious. Just you got to be you got to have everything on point to be virtuous, completely virtuous. Then there are these 2 categories in between. Aristotle calls this one enkrosis. To be in control, right? Or to be in rule of oneself. Crassus, like democrasis. Democracy is rule by the demos, right? The common people. Encrasis is to be in control. You don't desire what's right, but you know what is right. And your reason triumphs over your desire, and you manage to do the right thing. This is a moral victory for most of us on most days, right? You're kind of like, I want that, but it's bad, but I'm not going to do it. And you're like, all right. Pat yourself on the back. Don't get too happy with yourself. That ain't virtue just yet. You got to get this thing on board. You also have the acratic person, the akrasis. Somebody who is not in control, who desires what is not good. They know what's good, but they don't desire it. Their rational soul and their irrational soul are not on the same page as one another. And when it comes time for action, guess who wins out? Yeah, desire wins out. That person is acratic. That's no good. You don't want to be that. These are most of our moral failings. Most of us are bouncing around between these two. Aristotle's pointing out that that's what we should be aiming for. And this involves moral virtue, and the way that moral virtue is attained is not just through talking or education. It's through habituation. It's through training. You train your irrational soul. You habituate your irrational soul into desiring the right sorts of things. This is why some folks are, cognitive behavioral therapy is totally what this is all about. It's think about the way that you want your soul to be and practice doing it over and over and over again until it becomes second nature. Until it becomes a habit, right? Yeah, until it becomes a hexis. Until it becomes just the way that your soul is ordered so that you have a propensity to act this way. Can you train your desires? Aristotle says, yes, you can. A lot of cognitive behavioral therapists say, of course you can. Give me a car battery with enough juice. I can train anybody's desires. It can be done. And Aristotle says, this is the trick. This is the trick to a flourishing life. If you don't get this habituation part done, you're never going to be better than the encratic person. And note that this is what Socrates and Plato were saying. They were saying knowledge of the good is all that's required for doing what's right. And some of us were suspicious of this. Some of us were like, I don't know about that. Is knowledge of the good enough? Because sometimes I know what's right, but I manage to still not do it. That's because I'm here. That's because we have some kind of fight between desire and the rational will. And the rational will didn't win out this time. There are two approaches to this. One, you can just expect your rational will to be strong enough to always triumph over desire. But it does seem like this is being at war with yourself all the time. Aristotle says, no. The easier way is to train desire to be on board with your rational will. They shouldn't be in conflict with one another. They should be in concert with one another. There should be harmony between these various parts of the soul. This one can't be other than it is. Don't try to change it. This one can be different. Maybe we have the option just let it do what it do and then hope that our will is strong enough, our rational will is strong enough to always do the right thing. But Aristotle's saying no. You got to shape this one. You got to train it. You got to habituate it. There's one more thing that needs to be said about moral virtue. Well, that's not true. There are many more things that need to be said about moral virtue. There's one more big topic that I want to address here in this meeting. And this is the famous doctrine of the mean. Just like Plato's allegory of the cave is one of those things that even if you've never read any Plato, maybe you've heard about the allegory of the cave. Even if you've never read any Aristotle, maybe you've heard about the doctrine of the mean. Just show of hands. Before the last reading that we had, you've at least heard about the doctrine of the mean? Oh, maybe it's not as popular as I thought it was, as it once was. All right, well then, this will be instructive. The doctrine of the mean is this idea that every virtue is a mean between two extremes. And I gotta be honest with you guys, of all of the things that I've read in the many years that I've been studying philosophy, of all the little ideas, of all the, first of all, of all the books that when I question like, what do I come back to over and over again in my everyday life? I gotta say, the Nicomachean ethics is probably the one piece of philosophy that I've read that has had the single biggest impact on my life. Maybe that's not true for everybody, but like when I start thinking about like when I get in a jam, especially a moral jam, and I'm like wondering to myself, like, am I on the right track here? I think back to like, what would Aristotle say? And I kind of go with that. And this is the central idea. It's this idea, every virtue is a mean between two extremes. Every virtue. A mean between two extremes. Which means, while vice is the opposite of virtue, every virtue, in fact, has two associated vices. It has an excessive vice. And it has a deficient vice. Now keep in mind, when I point out that like we have a deficient vice and an excessive vice, there's no such thing as being too virtuous. Virtue is the mean between the two extremes of excess and deficiency. You can't be too balanced. Does that make sense? There's no such, like, I'm kind of like, oh, I'm balanced. You're like, oh, maybe you're too balanced. Like, what the hell is that? There's no too balanced. There's too much to the right, too much to the left, but no such thing as too balanced. If we're thinking about this in terms of a target, that virtue is a target that I'm aiming for. There's like the bullseye, and you're like, oh, you were too much in the center of that target. And you're like, no such thing. You can't be too much in the center. You can be too far to the right, too far to the left, too far up, too far down, but not too much in the center. There's no such thing as too virtuous. There is such a thing as having excess with respect to the thing that the virtue is concerned with. Because all of our virtues concern these parts of the irrational soul that speak the same language as the rational soul, what we're going to be looking to here is every virtue being concerned with some sort of emotion. So let's take the two most basic emotions that every animal has, including us: fear and desire. Let's start with fear. Is there a virtue that's associated with fear? What's it called? Courage. Now, is courage the same as just being completely fearless? No. Courage is the mean between two extremes with respect to fear. It's having the right amount of fear. At the right time. With the right feeling, etc. In the right respect, there's a whole laundry list of like, it's got to be done in the right way and at the right time and with the right sort of feeling, etc. Fear is this right amount of courage. What is too much? Courage is the right amount of fear. Did I say fear is the right amount of courage? That's silly. Courage is the right amount or the right sort of fear. Too much fear? What do we call that? Yeah, we call that one cowardice. And a lot of us stop right there. A lot of us just say like, courage is like the opposite of cowardice. Cowardice is too much fear. I guess courage is no fear. And this is why sometimes people will say courage isn't always a good thing. Malarkey.
Too much.
Yeah, or you could have too much courage. No. Courage is the right amount. Courage is always the right thing. The deficient vice, what do we call that? Not enough fear? Is there a word for that? That captures not only that it's a fearlessness, but also that it's a bad kind of fearlessness. It's a corruption of the soul somehow. Yeah.
Arrogance?
Part of it. Right. Naivety, ignorance. But ignorance is about knowledge. It was specifically about fear. Recklessness. Yeah, recklessness or rashness. Yeah, there we go. Recklessness. So we have a deficient vice in recklessness, we have an excessive vice in cowardice, and then we have the right sort of balance. We've struck the mean between recklessness and cowardice, and that's what courage is all about. It's about having the right sort of fear. For example, you want to fear things that are actually dangerous. That fear is a very useful tool. That keeps you alive. That keeps you flourishing. If you don't have that, you're not going to do very well. Do you know people who don't have enough fear? And do they get themselves into trouble? Yes, this is no good. You want to have that fear. Then again, sometimes there's too much fear. And sometimes it's about, like, there is something that's genuinely scary because it is dangerous, but I'm too scared of it. For example, I got a thing with heights. I realized it when I was 19 years old. I was painting my parents' house, and I was up on the roof, and suddenly I was just like, oh, you know what? This scares me, like, really scares me, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to get down without help. So here's this kind of like crack in the floor tile here. I can walk right up to that line. I can lean over it, stand on one foot like this. Like I'm not like the most graceful person in the world, but I can do this. If this was the edge of the Grand Canyon, there's no way that I could do that. Not even close. And it's not like I wouldn't do it because it seems too risky or too reckless. I couldn't do it if I had to. Like if there was like a $1 million bill hanging from a tree, like on the edge, and I had to like reach over and take it. And I was like, well, that's risky, but $1 million, maybe that's worth it. I could totally do it here. No problem. If this was the Grand Canyon, there's no way I could do it. I would be too fearful. If I had to save somebody's life, some kid like fell over the edge, and he's like holding on by like a root, and somebody's like, save my baby, and I'm like, I'll save your baby, and then I go up to the edge, like, there's no way. I would want to do it. I would really want to, and then as I got closer, I'd be like, I can't do it. That's cowardice. It's a problem. It's too much. It's an unreasonable amount of fear. It's a fear of something that is genuinely dangerous, but I feel it too much. And it's paralyzing. Anybody here afraid of spiders? Yeah, like crazy, like cowardly afraid of spiders in this way that like they're not that dangerous. There's a small number of spiders that are dangerous to adult humans.
Depends.
And only 2 of them live in North America. And even those, if you go to the doctor, you're gonna be okay. You'll get a scar, maybe, a little bit.
But
It's true. But these are not typically, black widows and brown recluses, that's not the spider that's like crawling across your wall. Or that maybe like those of you who are afraid of spiders, what if it was time for you to go to bed? You were like so tired, you just wanted to sleep, and there was a spider on your pillow.
nope.
And you had no roommates around that could come and like shoo the spider up. Most people I know that are really scared of spiders, they won't even kill them. They certainly won't scoop them up and take them outside. Which seems like the right way to handle a spider. Be like, oh, you're inconvenient to me and I'm scared of you. Boom, kill you. Not actually that dangerous. Would you sleep on the couch instead of in your own bed rather than try to deal with this spider? I
it
have
was
one
a big
person,
spider.
yes, my spider-afraid people. That's a problem. That's like, that is too much fear of something that is not actually dangerous. And it stops you from doing the things that you need to do. Now, of course, you could have too little fear and be like way over here as well. Part of, I think, one of the interesting things about this doctrine of the mean is that while it's difficult to give like an abstract prescription for exactly what the right amount of fear is, exactly where that sweet spot of the mean for courage is, I know which way I'm missing it frequently. I know like which side of this I'm on. Am I like, and maybe it's different for different sorts of things. With some things I'm too reckless, with some things I'm too cowardly. But I know when I'm missing it and I know which way. Just having these 2 vices, the deficient and the excessive vice. And by the way, you can look at this in like a couple of different ways. I used recklessness as the deficient vice because it was like not enough fear, right? A deficient amount of fear, whereas cowardice is an excessive amount of fear. Instead of fear, we could think of it as like, I don't know, your ability to stand up to fear, which is an important thing to have. But you could have it too much. You could like be in situations that you're like actually feel the fear, but I'm like, screw it, I'm doing it anyway, because you have this like ability to kind of like stand firm in the face of fear, which is important. Everybody should have it. Being courageous requires that there are some times where there are things that like, this is scary. Like if you're a soldier and the enemy is coming at you to kill you, you need to stand your ground and fight anyway. That's what's required. You need to have this thing that says like, they're going to kill me and I'm scared. It is appropriate. It would be reckless for a soldier to have no fear of dying whatsoever. They wouldn't last long. They would die, right? You need to have some fear, and that fear kind of like, in those of us who like maybe, anybody here been a soldier before? Some people have been, all right, yeah. So there are like these situations, and maybe it's about like warfare, maybe it's about other sorts of things where fear actually gets you up. Like now your adrenaline is pumping and you're ready to act. It's an important thing to be able to have. It's also important to be able to stand firm in the face of fear and not run whenever you're afraid. So you could have that in excess. That standing up to fear could be something that you have in excess, and that's recklessness. Or you could have a deficiency of the ability to stand up to fear, and that would be cowardice. So there are lots of ways of describing this. Yes?
I have a question.
Sure.
Would bravery or cowardice, would that be a rational soul or an irrational thing? Because are you born
This is
with
a
bravery?
courage is a moral virtue. You are not born with courage. You are born with the capacity to experience fear. And you were born with the ability for like you or your parents, at first it's your parents, and then as you get older, it's you kind of take over, to train that fear so that you have it in the right amount, with respect to the right things, at the right time, blah, 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 all of those things. Fear is part of the irrational soul that speaks the same language as the rational soul. It's a trainable part of the irrational soul. So is desire, by the way. Everybody is born with a capacity for desire. You're not born with courage. You're born with the potential to be courageous, reckless, or cowardly. Because you're born with the ability to experience fear. You're born with the ability to experience desire. Can you desire too much? What do you call that when you desire too much? Greed. If it's with respect to money, it's greed. There are all kinds of things. We have so many different words for desiring too much that we have a different word for different things that get desired. Yeah, obsession. What else? What if it's food? I desire food too much? Gluttony. What if I desire sex too much? Like most of the deadly sins are like excesses of desire, inability to control desire. Is it bad to have no desire at all? Can you have a deficiency of desire?
Yes.
Notice we don't have quite so many words for that.
Sloth?
Maybe that's because, sloth might be one of them. Clinical depression might be a description of somebody that just has no desire or not enough desire. What's the sweet spot? What do we call that? The right amount of desire? Moderation. Temperance. Temperance is usually the word. Temperance is to be in control of yourself and your desires, to have like the right amount of desire and the right attitude towards it, to desire the right things, in fact, as well. Those are two big ones, but we can do this for anything. We could do it for friendship. We could do it for honesty. We could do it for anger. Any emotion that you feel, any virtue, anything that you're thinking to yourself like, that's a good way to be, or like, I want to work on this about myself. We can put it through this doctrine of the mean mechanism and figure out like, all right, so what's the excessive vice? What's the deficient vice? Which one do I tend to be on the side of? And where do I need to work towards? What do I need to train my soul to do better? Yeah. Yeah, it depends on if we mean like a capital V or a lowercase v. If you want like legit virtue, like the telos, like the goal that maybe you don't actually reach, but you're always striving for. Sometimes folks will think about this virtue as it's too perfectionistic. I'm just kind of like, well, it's a goal, it's a target. You don't always hit the bullseye, but you're always trying to get closer to the bullseye, right? So yeah. Capital V virtue would be complete virtue, where everything is just like you never make the mistake. Now keep in mind, that doesn't guarantee a good life. That doesn't guarantee flourishing, because you could just have bad fortune. Jet engine could fall out of the sky and kill you.
Killed by a jet engine.
Could just be unlucky. But as Aristotle says, and this is something I think for all of us to keep in mind, when bad fortune comes your way, the virtuous person is usually able to weather that storm better than the vicious person will. So we might not be able to say that you're completely eudaimon if the universe just craps on you. But you'll come out of that crap better if you're virtuous than if you were vicious, or even if you were encratic or acrat. We'll pick this up some more on, what's today? Thursday? So we'll pick this up some more on Tuesday. We'll talk a little bit more about this, and we'll get into book 3 where we start talking about choices, and whether or not virtue is actually in our control.